It's called Street Gang: How We Got to Sesame Street. I was immediately drawn to it because a couple of years ago there was a documentary about Mr. Rogers' neighborhood called "Won't You Be My Neighbor," and as a kid growing up in the '80s, like these are the shows. These were the formative shows. That first documentary about Fred Rogers was so beautiful and insightful and tear-inducing. I had to just see what was going to be done with a look at Sesame Street. Now, this one's not as hard-hitting, but despite that, it's still a really good look at the formative years of the show, not just how it was created, but how the entire children's television workshop was created, how John Stone and Joan Gans Cooney got together to create this show, how they integrated education, how Jim Henson and Frank Oz got the Muppets involved, some of the stories behind the more iconic songs like These Are the People in Your Neighborhood and Being Green. There are some slightly, I guess, I don't know if darker is the right word moments to it, but certainly not sunshiny moments. That all kind of just aids in this nice little entry level exploration of how one of the most enduring television programs was created. I mean, we're talking a show that's been around for a little more than 50 years now. I think half the nation at this point has never lived in a world without Sesame Street. There were some things that seemed patently obvious that never even occurred to me when I watched the show as a kid. Like just the fact that it takes place on a block, that it's outside in the street. That was 100% intentional because the creators, John Stone and Joan Gans Cooney, they wanted to basically appeal to inner city youth who wouldn't necessarily have a playground to go to or a suburban sprawling social life to grow up in. They wanted to basically imbue them with neighborhood and urban pride from the very beginning. And as a kid, that's just something that I would just gloss over. Didn't even register for me. But I can only imagine now, especially in the 60s and 70s, how important that was to a kid growing up in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or any major city that didn't necessarily have the preschool or after school resources that someone like me growing up in the suburbs had. So something that just was a thing to me, it was just there, could have been one of the most profound things ever, and that just blew my mind a little bit.
One question I had, though, so I haven't seen the picture yet, is is it just sort of Sesame Street begins, or is it how long a span of time does it cover?
This is actually kind of one of the few critiques I have of the film, apart from the fact that it's never going to do anything that looks remotely untoward. Um, there's a little bit of a lack of focus on as to who the movie's about, rather as opposed to what the movie's about. Because they talk about things like John Stone, spending his whole life with depression, but they don't mention how he actually passed away of ALS. The film essentially ends with Jim Henson's death in the early '90s, and that famous scene of Big Bird and Kermit singing "Being Green" at his funeral. That's basically where the story ends. So it goes from the formation in the late '60s up until about 1990, when Jim Henson passes. And while the film will never court controversy, it isn't afraid to basically make you cry, because they do deal with things like the original Gordon on the show, who Matt Robinson, who I never knew was Holly Robinson Pete's father. I was like, Roosevelt Franklin was one of my favorite characters. I never knew he was the voice of Roosevelt Franklin. And then there was a whole falling out with about that character that forced him to leave the show, and then they replaced him, and kind of as a tribute, eventually renamed Gordon and gave him Robinson as a last name. And then, of course, they do deal with what is still to this day the saddest moment in television history, the death of Mr. Hooper, Will Lee. Like I still cry watching that scene, nearly 40 years later, because Will Lee died about 4 months after I was born, but the show always existed in reruns on PBS, so I watched episodes with Mr. Hooper well into my elementary school days. So I was aware of him, and when they aired reruns, they were always out of sequence. So sometimes he'd be there, sometimes he wouldn't be. And then when they would rerun the episode where they address his death, I was just like, oh no. Oh, but it's one of the most cathartic moments in media history, not just television, just all of media. That's where this movie really succeeds, is in how they taught the lessons, like the creation of Count Von Count to teach numerology, not just teaching you how to know numbers, but how to engage with them and how to comprehend them in different contexts, that sort of thing. Like the integration of Spanish and sign language. When I was a kid, that was all I ever learned of the two. But that was what the show meant to me and millions of others. So to get that little insight into it, to see how Carol Spinney evolved Big Bird as a character, to hear how Being Green was written and how the inspiration went. Those are the things that, per the production company, that is the chicken soup for the soul. That's what you actually need. It's comfort food.